So I'd like to welcome Frank Howell, K4FMH, to Denby Dale. Second time you've been here, Frank. You came last year in one of our earlier meetings of the year, and you made a very, very thoughtful contribution about the future of radio clubs. Tonight's meeting, the subject that you've offered to speak at is on looking at HF radio performance, and does price buy you performance or satisfaction or both? And you've done some work on this, and you've sent me a couple of articles that I've sent round. So hopefully people will find I've had a look at your presentation. It's absolutely fascinating. In advertising the meeting tonight, Frank, I posted this in a couple of the amateur radio forums in the UK, one of them Southgate Radio News, and the other on a couple of the Facebook amateur radio groups in the UK. And it started a bit of controversy with guys going absolutely bonkers. You know, why don't you go and build a radio? You know, don't spend £3,000 on a radio, and surely you need to start on something simple. And actually, the most important thing is your antenna, and so on. All those type of comments, which Frank, you were in Rob's contribution last week, and Frank made the point. Rob made the point last week, didn't he? That the starting point is your antenna before you do anything else. You need a decent antenna to radiate. So Frank, with that introduction, I'm going to hand over to you. And when you want me to put the slides up, I'll do it for you, and we'll take it from there.
Well, Nick, thank you very much for that introduction and the preface. No one likes controversy, but it does draw attention. So perhaps that spark will generate some interest in in the program. What I'll do, Nick, I don't do a very good Boris Johnson impression, so I'm just going to give you a thumbs up to change the slides. How about that? Okay. I'm very honored and very flattered. Anytime you are asked to come back within roughly a year to speak to any group, it means you at least didn't make them all mad. So I'm very honored and flattered. What I recommended to Nick was that I've gotten to know Rob Sherwood fairly well in doing this study. Now, in true confession, I was a customer of Rob Sherwood some, I don't know, 10 years ago. I bought a Japanese radio NRC 545, and he did a mod on it, and he sold that rig. So I've been a customer of Rob Sherwood's, and I read his work, as he mentioned, back when it was a passport to all band radio, world band radio, or something like that, and read his reviews, and I actually wrote him and asked him questions from time to time. I absolutely revere Rob Sherwood's work. I think that he is a treasure, as I said in a commentary on his presentation, and in no way should the fact that I do something a little different, but I have a different reason for doing it, should be taken as a criticism for Rob Sherwood table. So, Nick, I'm not really seeing my slides, but you may want to check that. It seems chopped off a little bit. And the reason that I wanted you to drive the car is so I wouldn't steer the car, being the slides, in the ditch while I'm speaking extemporaneously. So I greatly appreciate your being my chauffeur. So
Okay, well, that's very strange. Technically, a couple of people are commenting. I'm just going to see what the problem is here. I'm going to stop for a second.
Well, if you need to replace my ugly mug with the slides, I'm sure that the guest will be appreciative, but whatever works on your end.
Yeah, just wondering, Frank, before you go on, can I just check on this? Right, a couple of people saying that they can't see all of the share and it's missing the edges.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
And the slide video is too big for the screen. I've got no idea why that's happening. And I'm just going to go back and have a look again and see what the problem here is. Um, right, what does it look like now, Frank?
Great. Just go back to that.
That's much
Perfect
better.
on my end. Perfect.
Okay, brilliant.
Great. So the focus of this talk is some work. I'm a sociologist and statistician. My PhD is in those subjects, and I have a minor in computer science. And I've been involved with technology since I was 8 years old. But I waited for various reasons we all know and love. I didn't have an Elmer. I went to college, worked my way through, went to graduate school, was a news director in the broadcasting business, and then went to graduate school, got a job, slayed the dragon, and retired and went on to a next job. And at 58, literally 50 years later, I actually got licensed. But I've been around amateur radio since I was 8 years old. And I think we've all looked at the question of buying a transceiver. And I looked at this and I thought, if you listen to other hams, they'll tell you a lot about themselves. And so I want to share with you this evening this study. The first part of it is in the ARRL's National Contesting Journal. I think I sent a PDF of that to Nick for redistribution. Now, the graphics of the online version are terrible, and I've sort of waved my arms at them. Let me help you fix that. They're great on my end. As in the PDF of the longer paper, but they have a problem that they need to work out with Page Suite over on your side of the pond. That's who they contract with to put their things online. So there's a glitch there somewhere. Does price buy performance or satisfaction in an HF transceiver? That's the main focus here. Now, several songs here. I was a disc jockey back in the day. So, the Beatles made Money Can't Buy Me Love, famous. The Rolling Stones, Can't Get No Satisfaction. And there's the ever popular saying, you get what you pay for. Now, that's a lot of common sense type of rhetoric that you may hear with fellow hams at a meeting, at a pub, wherever. The ARL has a little pamphlet, Which Rig Should I Buy? And I think Steve Ford captured it. You finally got some coppers together to buy some equipment, but you really can't mess up. You've got to do the right thing. And if you ask any veteran ham, they will tell you that blankety blank so-and-so rig, I should have never bought it. So you've got some horror stories. Nobody wants to waste money, but how do you figure out which one is best? There isn't an answer for best to everyone, but how do you figure out one which is best for you? And the question that I have is, does this logic work in amateur radio? Now, neither the ARL or RSGB recommend specific transceivers. Both of them published a bench test of selected rigs, and you have some fantastic people on your side of the pond. Rob Sherwood over here, as you found out during your last talk, has published a table of his suite of bench tests for receiving. The popular eham.net has a crowdsourced volunteer rating of their satisfaction with the rig, and they have some narratives that get quite charming at times of different amateur radio products. So those are some sources that we use. And so, back one, I think, right? Or are you on the right one? So hams are left with some complicated options. You can ask other hams what they like and what to stay away from. You can go through all those bench ratings. Now, for people that don't play the stock market investments, it's about as exciting as that sometimes. If you don't do bench measurement, going through all those little things that Rob, go back one if you would. Stay on that one. Thank you. They're boring to some people, but if you do bench testing, then you love that stuff. And you can look at Rob's tables and see what's best on the bench. I'll talk about that in a moment. You can go to EHAM and you can read all the product reviews to see who likes what, and why. Now, I want to tell you, for the rigs in my study, I've read every single review on EHAM for every single rig, more than once at times. And so you learn quite a lot. Now, if all that gets, you to scratching your head, many times what we wind up doing is getting frustrated and we say, here's my money, take it, give me a good rig. But how much quality or satisfaction does that money get you? And will it guarantee you that you'll have a bench measured, good performing rig and that you'll like it? I'm going to convince you, I hope tonight, no, it does not guarantee you that you will get that. Now, this can be like the proverbial dog chasing his tail. And it's not that those sources are challenging. I'm sure all of you have gone through many of them, and you may jot down some things as you try to look at rigs. The problem is that putting them together in a coherent way is a struggle. Now, next slide. So what I've tried to do is to look at, does throwing money at a rig work? And I've compiled a unique data set from 3 sources that have price, received performance, and consistent consumer satisfaction ratings for each rig in Rob Sherwood's table. I'm sure with his talk last time, you may have gone to his website. And you've probably looked at the EHAM product ratings. Now, they're generally considered the holy grail. If you're an Indiana Jones fan and the Knights Templars in one of them, you've chosen wisely. That's what you'd like to have. And you use Rob Sherwood's table. Now, what's cool about his stuff, and the ARL gets criticized for this, whether it's true or not, right or wrong. Sherwood's independent. He takes no advertising. He actually gets an unmarked rig. They don't send him one they've checked out and made sure it's working and all that stuff. He's also highly trusted because he'll speak his mind, and he's differed from ARL in how they measure some things. So I've tried to make use of Rob's stuff because of that stature and how well that's received. Now, this data set is what I use to investigate the relationships among price, performance, and satisfaction for individual rigs. You'd have to go write all this stuff down for each rig to put those sources of information together. And I've taken the time to done that. And as far as I can tell, it's the first time anybody has reported such a study. So if there's another one, I missed it. Next slide. Now, I'll go through this because it's really important for you to know what I have done and what I have not done. Now, all the sources are well known. And I want to point out, when I say rig, I'm using that intentionally because a few of the radios in Rob Sherwood's table are receivers only, and most are transceivers. The year of the release of each of those rigs to the market covers an amazing 50-year period. Now, there are a few major or really popular rigs that are left out of those tables, but not every rig listed to the market is included. So keep that in mind. Now, there are some minor problems in that there were a few rigs on Sherwood's tables that were not on EHAM. Those are crowdsourced. Nobody bothered to log them in and write a review, which gets other people to write reviews. And so a very small number. I couldn't do anything there, so I omitted them. A few of the rigs in Rob's tables, as he mentioned in the last club talk, had second measurements. They either had a key upgrade or there was some modification. Well, to keep those consistent, I took the first review of the stock rig on the measurements. That keeps it consistent. So there's a total of 126 rigs from his tables used in my study. All right. And I want to dwell for one moment on price. It's important here. So I've already, from my National Contesting Journal article, I've already had some people write me, oh, I can get this 7,300 at Bob's radio shop for less, and I can do this, that, and the other. Price in this study, and it's what economists use, the suggested retail price or the observed retail price at the time of release to the marketplace is what I'm focusing on. I don't track discounted retail prices, hamfest sales, or used prices. So price here means the product value placed on the rig by the manufacturer. And economists feel like that is a signal to the marketplace. Here's what we think this is worth. Your mileage may vary. It's the only way to have a consistent rig to rig metric for differentiating price at market entry. We all look to see what the new Yaesu FTDX 101, hey, how much, what they asking for that? Well, that may not be what you pay for it. And that's the difference I'm making. What does the manufacturer say this is worth? And we used to have something in the States called manufacturer's suggested retail price, MSRP. It's not used as much anymore. Now, most price data came from the ARL QST magazine. I worked with Mark Wilson to make sure I understood carefully how they source that material. A few of the vintage rigs, I spent quite a bit of time going back and even locating for Collins and Drake some of their actual catalogs, the year that it appeared in their catalog to get what they were asking for that rig. I used other magazine ads. I've got a nice collection of historical CQ Ham Radio Magazine and Monitoring Times uh, on on uh, um, on my local area network. I have all that stuff in digital form, so I can do a keyword search. There were a few rig tracking websites like Rig Picks and some others. So I got every one of them allocated. Now, one problem I've got is because it's 50 years, as we all know, a dollar or a pound 50 years ago is substantially different from today. So I transformed the rig price data into 2019 US dollar values using our Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index. Very common, very typical way of doing that. So these are all in 2019 dollars. You can do a dollar to pound conversion in 2019. That's commonly available online. I use it all the time when I go to buy something from something in the UK. And so that should be somewhat convenient for you. Next slide. So let's look at this. If you look at this chart, it's a histogram, the distribution of prices for each of the 126 rigs. You'll see that on the left side, there are the bins that are just a number of dollars and how many fall in that bin. Most of them are down around the median, just maybe a little less than that, of $3,177. But look over to the right. Geez, what's 25 grand? I suspect some of you already know because when I logged into the Zoom, I heard people talking about Collins, and indeed, you'll see that in more detail. So you've got some of the premium price rigs, even in constant dollars there, but most of them bunch up either above or below the median. So next slide. That's what it looks like. So performance is the from the Sherwood table. Now, I would encourage you, at the risk of just being a blatant advertiser of the podcast that I belong to, the ICQ podcast. I had the pleasure of interviewing both Rob Sherwood and Bob Allison of ARL Test Lab in episodes 305 and 312 of the ICQ podcast on how they do tests, the ups and downs, the criticisms, and things like that. If you're interested, I think you'll learn a lot. I know I did. Now, Sherwood uses several measurements. We'll look at in a future slide, we'll look at a few of them. And he talked to you about them in detail. But he ranks his table in order of the best score on one single measurement, narrow space dynamic range in dB. Now, his reasoning is this: after years of testing, that's the single best criterion for him for the CW contest operator. Now, he is one, and he's a very good one. And I have no doubt that that is true, valid, and in every way meritorious. But if you think about it, if you're not a CW operator, even if you're a contester and you're a sideband operator, or if you're not a contester at all, there might be another aspect of receivers performance that might be more relevant. So what do we do? Well, if you look at his website, and there's a screenshot. If you think about this for a moment, if you go to a restaurant, some restaurants will allow you to order a la carte. Hey, I want fish, but I can't stand chips. Don't give me chips. I want something else. Well, you might not get to do that. You might get to do it in a restaurant, but you don't get to do that with a transceiver. Most transceivers have a design, they have specifications. You may get one or two minor options, an extra filter, one little widget or another. But by and large, the ABC transceiver is what the engineers produced it to be. So you're not a la carte ordering. You don't get a certain noise floor or an AGC threshold or a blocking factor or a sensitivity and so on and so on. You choose a receiver based upon the realized measured specification. So what I did was I put all of them together as the broadest measure of the quality of each one of the rigs in Sherwood's tables. He and I shared a lot of information about that. Combined them all into a single index of received performance. I'll show it to you. Next one. Principal components analysis has been used in propagation studies and from achievement tests to just, it's a well-oiled statistical tool uh, for almost 100 years. Now, what it does is this. It says, okay, you've got these variables, the variables in Sherwood's table. They all measure differences in each of the rigs. How many of those differences correspond to one another? Do they kind of pull together? That is, if you have a better rig in close in, narrow range, dynamic range, do you have better sensitivity? Do you have better this? Do you have better that? Do you have better the other? Well, yes, but it's not perfect. And if you'll look in this chart, Nick, if you'll put your arrow on the loading in the pattern matrix, that column, you'll see the loading figure 0.278 for the noise floor, 0.411 for the AGC threshold, and so on and so on. Which of those numbers are the highest? Guess what? The narrow range at 0.830 is that's Rob's favorite for CW contesting is the second largest loading, only succeeded by the ultimate dB in the filter system. So those components of the Sherwood Performance Index, not Rob's name, but my name given to respect the fact that he did the work, is weighted by that. And as he said in his talk, the noise floor isn't much of a factor anymore. Well, it has a very low weight, right? Sensitivity isn't as important as it used to be. I have a Drake TR7. It is my grandfather's Buick or Oldsmobile car. It's the old Roadmaster. It's wonderful. It just doesn't work like some of the new rigs do. I love it still, and it's in my shack, but it doesn't have the sensitivity that my Kenwood 590 SG has, for example. So those are how this one index was put together. And it covers, and Nick, if you'll look at the eigenvalues, percent of variance, that top one of 40.894, 41% of all of the differences in all of Rob Sherwood's measurements are in that first component. And if you go to that scree plot, you see how I have that red line? If you're a geologist, you'll know that scree, those little pebbles that gather at the bottom of a hill. And when Raymond Cattell, the statistician who helped develop principal components analysis, he had done some geological work. He labeled this because, as you see, that's like a hill. And when does it turn down and begin to get the same descent? And so you can see that first component that has an eigenvalue of a little less than 4, that's by far the dominant component here. You could have multiples. If any of you are mathematicians, you'll know that we're using eigenvector decomposition to compute all this. All right, enough of that mumbo jumbo. We've got a consistent, consolidated measure using all of Rob Sherwood's measurements. Why did they use them all? Why does he measure them all? Because each one is important and they tell you a little bit more about a rig. So that's performance, and I wanted to walk you through what that really is. Next one, please. So let's look at it. The Sherwood Performance Index, it doesn't have a real world metric like a year, an age, a dollar or pound. It doesn't have a natural metric. It has a Z-score, or mean of 0 and standard deviation of 1. So I gave it an arbitrary metric, just like we do IQ scores. I added 100 to each value and I multiplied it by 15. That gives it an average of 100 and a standard deviation of 15, much like IQ test. Now keep in mind the 15, because if you look at that chart, another histogram, you'll see as you move away from the average, when you get 15 points away, you think, that's beginning to be a distance. When you get 3 standard deviations away, or 3 times 15 is 45, that should be 99% of all of the observations. So, wow, that's out in the market. So look at what we can then see with the Sherwood Performance Index. We've got some radios that are more than 2 standard deviations better than the average rig in Sherwood's table. He'd never seen this, by the way, when I shared this with Rob. Now, on the other hand, down on the low end, you've got some that were 60. Now, 60 is 40 away from 100, right? So that's more than 2 standard deviations. It follows what we typically call a normal distribution. Really, it's one that's symmetric. And I put a little blue line in there for that normal distribution. Keep in mind, those rigs up there on the right end, we're going to come back to those and we're going to take names and tell you which ones they are. So let's go now to the next slide. All right, satisfaction. It came from EHAM. They rate each rig. They give you a narrative. Now, they're rated from 1 being the lowest to 5 being the highest. Now, let me wave my arms. This is the cumulative average, which reflect the ratings that were voluntarily given by HAMS as of November 2019. They aren't a random sample of owners. They volunteer. Just like those who go down and work the HMS Belfast, that you volunteer. Nobody made you go. It reflects the complete experience with that rig, the manufacturer, and sometimes the reseller. If you read those EHAM reviews, as I did, you'll see they get mad with the reseller, and that sours the experience. Or the rig arrived and it just wouldn't work, but the reseller was so good, they either swapped it out or fixed it, and boom, they loved it. So keep that in mind. It's the cumulative average over the life of a rig's existence in the marketplace, and not measured just after release. Well, is that all that bad? When you think about it, a rig that stands the test of time, that's probably a decent measure too. This is not perfect, but it's a measure. And here's what's more important. HAMS use this to make decisions with. So even if it may not be the best measurement in the world, there are 2 things. We act as if it were, because it's really the only game in town for consistent, consolidated set of ratings over HAM products and service. Those were my measures. Let's take a look at the EHAM ratings in the next slide. Well, here's what they look like. Unlike the price that was skewed over to the right, they're skewed over to the left. The average rating, I don't know if you were aware of this, the average rating is 4.6 or 4.7. The median's 4.7. In other words, you've got to work to get a bad review here. Those down around 3.8, we're going to reveal the name of that one And so you can see that it's a little bit of a halo effect. Halo being, hey, I love my rig. Is that rationalization for I've already spent my money? You know, I said, here's my money, take it. I've got it now. I can't hate it, right? Maybe. Um, what I'm going to do, I've got a web scraping script that I wrote, and I've already done this. I did this a couple of years ago to see if I could do it. And I talked to the EHAM owners, and they're fine with it. I'm going in and scraping every review of every product and service, not just the rigs on Sherwood's table, but everything. Put that in the database. I'm going to analyze them. I'm going to come back to the rigs here. So in a year or two, you may see another paper where I've got the individual reviews. And I'm going to look at how this affects the variation in the rig. You know, you have some rigs that everybody loves. You have some rigs that some love and some hate. We're going to find some here in the study. So I'm going to get to the nitty gritty here in maybe a year, I hope. We'll get to that. So I got more coming, but enough about what I'm going to do. Let me tell you what I am doing. Let's go to the next slide. So here's some of the basic data. Here's the top and bottom 10 rigs in price, both the nominal price in the price that was released back when it was released, and then adjusted to 2019 dollars. What takes the cake? That Collins R390A in 2019 dollars, it would sell for about $24,000. Now, when you realize that when it was released in the US, you could buy a house for that amount of money easily. So it was released in 1954. But as you go down, the famous Hilberling rig, high dollar rig, Ray Cal from your neck of the woods. And as you look at them, those were some of the highest priced rigs. Well, let's look at some of the bottom ones. You've got some of the receivers and the venerable Drake R4C in 1973. That's as Bob told you, that's what he got to testing. And it's what led him into what he's done over a lifetime. And so I think that will tell you a little bit about. I have an FT891 from Yaesu. I didn't pay $729 for it. I paid a little less. I waited maybe for 6 months or so, and you can get them for almost $500 now. So that gives you a little bit of feel for that. Let's go to the next slide, and you'll see some more data. Here's the top 10 and bottom 10 on the consumer satisfaction rating and the measured performance in the Sherwood Performance Index. So let's look at satisfaction. Well, it's no surprise that a bunch of them are fives when the median is 4.7. And those are just the top 10 among those were five. There were some others that had fives. Now look at the bottom 10 rigs. My good friend Ray Novak of ICOM USA, I'm sorry, but the dog in the bunch is the ICOM R72 in terms of satisfaction by ham, 3.8. The Atlas 350, which was kind of famous, I think it was the first all solid state rig. I may be wrong, but I think that's the case. 3.9 and so on. Notice that a recent fairly popular rig, the Yaesu FT991, not the 991A, but the 991, it didn't get quite as much love as the average rig. Let's look at the performance, which was the one that went way out to the end. Well, it was close, but the Flex 6000 series, the 6600M, 143, the Yaesu FTDX 101D, that was the first 101 dB radio for Rob's favorite measure, overall 137.5. The Flex 6400, which I have, was then next. 7851 from ICOM. And you recognize these because you've looked at the advertisements. Some of you may have them. Some of you may have salivated and wished you had them. And then you look at the bottom 10 on performance. So you got some variation. But Nick, if you'd go back one slide, I want to make a point. How many of them are all in the top or bottom? Wouldn't you want to have one in the bottom on price? And now go forward one slide. But in the top of satisfaction and performance. That's what we love to have, right? We want the most for the least. Did you see any of them that were in those top 10? I don't think you did. So, how do we take the aggregate data and disentangle it and make sense? Well, this is what I've tried to do. Let's go to the next slide. Now, let's look at the trends. It's always good as a statistician to look at just the basic patterns. I've showed you the distribution, and you get a sense of, of how that works. Here are the trends in price, and this is in 2019 dollars. Um, wow, you can see that Collins over there with that red spike there. The two real price jumps with adjusted prices were around 1990. Now, in the U.S., the post-1980s recession that affected U.S. and Japan, you can see how the prices went up, and it's there in the data. Then later, about 2000, but particularly 2010, you saw another spike with the introduction of what I'd call the premium HF rigs. And you'll hear it today. I can't believe what they want for some of these rigs. Well, the premium rigs really emerge there, and you see it in these data. But note, even though we adjust for inflation, the overall patterns mirror one another. Next slide. All right, now let's look at this Sherwood index, because this basic slide is something that Rob had not seen. And let's look at it. Tells a little bit of the history we're going to see in the rest of the study. The median score is 100. You see that red line going from left to right. So back at the early phase, the performance, the Collins rig was about average. And if you remember, Rob said on his transmit side, not what's in his receive tables, but the quality of the transmit for his Collins was the best he's ever seen. So Art Collins built a good rig. So you look at the performance on those numbers, it just bebops around and it gets back up to the overall median about the 2000. Sorry. Then what happens? It skyrockets. When Rob said we have the best receive radio that we've ever had, I'm going to add this phrase to it. It's not even close. Look at the lines on that graph. 15 points, then up to 30 points, 2 standard deviations away. The current rigs are 2 standard deviations over the median over the last 50 years. Amazing. Next slide. Now, while that one was clear, this one doesn't look to be clear, but there's an explanation. If you look at those funny looking tan boxes, a statistician named John Tukey developed a box and whisker plot to help you look at the overall distribution of data. You look at that middle bar in each of those tan boxes, that's the median. And then the rest of those shapes tell you what the 75th and 25th percentile is, and so on and so on. And that ICOM R72 is a true extreme value. You see it down the bottom. If it's shown, it's an extreme value, but statistically so. There are 2 things for this chart. Now remember, they're not all rigs. They're only the rigs Rob Sherwood has in his table. Over time, the median satisfaction has been absolutely constant, right at 4.7. It was a little higher in the pre-1970 era, but every one of them is the same on the median. There's clearly a lot of variation within each decade. Now, from year to year, I've got a line chart, and it goes, up, down, and all around. And Rob and I went back through this because we wanted to understand it. What's going on? That's a typical sign, that line, that's a typical sign of random variation. It's just almost unpredictable. The decade data, however, are a sign of a fairly constant pattern. And so it's the time period imposed on the rigs that Rob chose to put in his table. So pretty constant on the median. Next slide. Now, if you saw the movie Finding Nemo, the little fish that got lost in the ocean, a cartoon movie, finding the optimal rig. Well, these data are what the typical ham in the marketplace has to deal with, aggregate data, and it's hard to tease them apart. Well, I take the individual rigs and have the data there, and I use what's called quadrant analysis. So if you do a little square box, like you were going to play the game tic tac toe, you've got above the median and below the median on one variable, and then below the median and above the median on another variable. And so if you want a high performance rig that everybody loves, you're going to get in that upper right quadrant, right? Because you're above average in performance and you're above average in how much love that rig gets. So that quadrant analysis is used frequently in the business world to try to get the best for the least. And I also do a performance per dollar bang for the buck here, and I want to show you that, and I think you'll really enjoy that one. Next slide. So this is the approach statistically that I go through. You can't read that slide, but we're going to come, Nick, if you'll just kind of make a note up there on that upper right quadrant. That is the Sherwood Performance Index, and if you're above that middle line, that blue line, you're above the median performance there. I'm sorry, that's the satisfaction. And if you're to the right of the red line, you're above performance. So those up in the upper red, which have some labels on them, they're the high performance, high satisfaction. Now let's look in that upper right hand quadrant. We're going to just look at that. Next slide. Now, that's the upper right quadrant. Well, what does that tell us? Well, look at what's happened. You've got some that are somewhat expensive that are very well liked. And you've got some that aren't liked as well, but they seem to do very well, like the Flex radios. The Yaesu FTD, that should be FTDX. I have FTDS in my slide. 101D is more expensive than the Flex, but higher in average satisfaction. So on the first cut, high performance, a lot of hams like them. You've narrowed the field down. If that's what you want to buy, then your big question is, how much does it cost? So in the bottom right there, Nick, you may want to illustrate. I've taken each data point, each rig, and I've put a shape and a color on them. If it's blue, it's in the lowest 25 percentile, about $19,000. Green and solid, it's 19,000 to 3,100. Then if it's a diamond and it's open and tan, it's 3,000 to 48, and then above 48. So, okay, here you are. You know, you got your money, and you go, let's see which one do I want. Wow, now, oh boy, that 7851 Icon makes a good radio, and that Yaesu does too. But I don't quite have the scratch here. Well, the Kenwood, it's still up there. Well, Elecraft KX3 and the Flex, I might be so see that's the logic that you can use to go narrow these things down. I'm going to continue with this type of analysis, but I wanted to stay on this for just a moment. Now, I'll show you that the Flex being an SDR, unlike the Anon, it's an SDR as well, but the Flex shifted from their Flex 3000 and 1500 series. I had a 3000. A friend of mine has it now and he loves it. He's a contester and he just loves it. There's a selling point that's a little more of a challenge for a radio without knobs. And even though Flex has some with a knob, I think they're facing a little bit of challenge there, but we're going to pick back up on that in just a moment. So I want to make sure you're all zoned in. We're doing the best quadrant for us in the data with some price points. Let's go to the next slide. Now, you can get a lot of you get a lot of rig for the money. If you'll read eHam or talk to other hams, you hear that all the time. You know, that ICOM 7300, man, it may not be the 7851, and you can't hook it up to a big screen and see the waterfall like you can with the 78. But for the money, you can't beat it. Now, what's Rob Sherwood measuring now? What did he tell you he was going to measure? The Xiegu G90, because the reputation is it's about 500 pounds or less, depending on where you buy it. You get a heck of a lot of radio for the money. Well, he's going to test it and see what it looks like. So I wanted to look at that. And what I did was I took the price in 2019 dollars, and remember how we used the performance thing and we created a T-score with an average of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. I took the dollars and I standardized them, took the mean away from it, and divide it by the standard deviation. That creates a Z-score. Add 100, multiply by 15, and then you get a T-score. So a 100 on the T-score version of the price is just like the Sherwood number. 100 is the median, 100 is the median. So if you did the Sherwood Performance Index divided by the price in a T-score, and you get a ratio of 1, what would you have? You would get a medium performing rig at a medium performing price. And if you got a ratio above 1, then you're getting more bang for the buck. And if you get more bang for the buck in terms of received performance, if you're getting one that's less than that, then you're getting less. So the same quadrant analysis was used. I also used the absolute price quartile. You know, my wife and I joke sometimes. She's a consumer economist, and a lot of retail stores will say, the more you buy, the more you save. And she'll mutter, and the more in debt you'll go, even though you're saving a lot of money. You also have to keep the bang for the buck relative to what the absolute price is. And I do that in the next slide. So let's look at, again, a messy quadrant, but we'll zone in what we need to be. That's the performance to price ratio. Above 1, you're getting more for your money. The average EHAM satisfaction. So if you want to get a bigger bang for the buck, and a lot of hams like it, you want to get that upper right-hand quadrant. And then I've used the same coloring and shaping to tell you what price category that they're in. Now, some rigs that are just beloved. I mean, I've always wanted a Raycal. I've never gotten one, but I read about the Raycal receivers, Collins as well. They just don't perform as well as others. And so here's a punchline here. If you look at the Hilberling, the performance, the price, it's below the median. And if you had the raw data, and I've got some of that over here, but you can see some of these rigs that cost a lot of money, you're not getting the performance, and you're not getting the performance relative to what you pay. So the punchline is money might buy you love, but love can cost you an awful lot. So let's go to the next one, and we'll focus on that upper right-hand quadrant. So back well. And again, you saw some similar players that we saw, the Apache Anon, the Yaesu FTDX 101, the Elecraft KX2, the little QRP rig, the Elecraft K3S. You know, everybody's waiting on the K4. The Kenwood TS590SG, the Elecraft K3, KX3, and both of the Flex rigs. Note that the Flex was on the bubble in terms of satisfaction. Now, I want to point out a sidebar. It was interesting to look at the Kenwood TS590S versus the successor 590SG. When I looked at those data, I have an SG. It jumped up, and bang for the buck, was there, and the ratings on EHAM were there. And Mark Wilson at QST said he just didn't understand that because they were the same radio. Well, if you're only looking at it from a bench point of view, it's not the same radio when you get it off the bench and get it out in an amateur radio's hands. So there's multiple things going on here, and I'm hoping I'm narrowing them down for you. So this is kind of the focus that I've given to this. And we go to the next slide. I want to show you this table. Now, this is a list of the top 25% in the performance to price ratio. Okay. I'm not there yet. I've got to upgrade something called PHP at my web hosting company and do a couple of mechanical things or technical things to foxmikehotel.com. But soon I will have this here, and I'll have a table where you can sort them however you want to, but I'll have these data out, the full one. This is the top 25%, which is, I think, where most of us would want to go. Top 25% in performance to price ratio. I've got the year it was introduced, the absolute PPR, the Sherwood Performance Index, the EHAM rating, the introductory price, the price in 2019 dollars, what quartile of satisfaction it was in, and then the quartile in terms of price. Now, I gave it some labels. Anytime you start labeling, it's subjective. So this is a little bit subjective, and you can label them however you want to. But there are three groups that I felt like stood out. One is the sweet spot. They're all in the top price performance. So among those, if you were tops in EHAM satisfaction, then you were in the top first or second quartile, the upper half in price. Well, that's kind of a sweet spot to me. And these include the Elecraft KX2. They're green on the chart. Elecraft K3S, the Kenwood 590SG, the ICOM 8600, which is a receiver only. But you noted that Rob Sherwood uses that very often in some of his contesting. And then the venerable Drake R4C. The hot rods, those that are the top performers, but they don't quite get as much love on EHAM, and they're in the top first two quartiles in price. The two Flex 6000 radios, the 6600M and the 6400, and the Elecraft KX3. Those that were top price performers, everybody loved them. They're tops in EHAM, but they're just more expensive. They're more expensive than the median rig. The Yaesu FTDX 101D, the Kenwood 890S, and the Apache Anon 7000 DLE. So that's my take on how you might want to slice and dice these. I think it helps you zone into as much of the objective elements on price, measured performance, and what most hams say they like or don't like about the rig. There's a couple of more things I want to look at because I think it'll help fill in the picture. Go to the next slide, if you will, Nick. Now, there's a couple of things I want to point out. Remember that throw money, hey, take my money. Well, if you buy a random high price rig, it does not guarantee that you're going to get performance because you'd buy that Hillbilling. If money guaranteed it, then Hillbilling would be selling. You might have hams that are divorced by their spouses because they would have overspent. But if money bought best performing rig and a rig that everybody loved, then Hillbilling would get it. But it doesn't. Now let's put a finer point on that. And I want to show what's related to it. Now, before we go to the next slide, I want to explain it. I'm using what's called a linear regression model. You've seen it, whether you realized it or not. Some of you may know how to use it and that sort of thing, depending on your background. But you've got a dependent variable you want to predict. And I'm going to look at the performance. I'm going to look at the EHAM satisfaction. So to what extent do certain variables increase or decrease when you take it compositely? You put them all together. And so in the next slide, we're going to look at that, and I'll explain what that is. Yeah. Nick, if you look at that rig performance index, so Sherwood's measurements that I put together, you'll see that that log of rig price, that beta coefficient of 0.341, that beta can go from 0 to 1. So price does buy a better performing rig, but why isn't it stronger? It's a 0.3, not a 0.9. So note, there's some things going on in the performance besides price. Well, look at when that rig was built, and you'll see if it was. Now, this is all relative to built from being released to the market in 2010 or later. Note that in the pre-1970s, that B coefficient is actually in the Sherwood metric number. So compared to 2010, even with price control, it's still 27.9 points, almost 2 standard deviations below, even with price control, the same. Look in the 70s, you're 25 points down. Look in the 80s, you're still 25 points down. Look in the 90s, you're 20 points down. Even in the 2000s with price control, you still perform almost 14, almost 1 standard deviation less on the bench than you do if it was a rig in 2010, even if price is controlled. Now, I'm like probably you. I know when I came in here, I was hearing some of you talk about rigs, and I love Collins, and here in the States, Drake was a favorite one. There used to be a saying, a rich man bought a Collins, a smart man bought a Drake. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But we have these identifications. You'll see all the swag, the hats and the shirts, ICOM, Yaesu, whatever. So what I did is I took some of the top manufacturers and I put them in this model. And if you're one of these top manufacturers, you get a score of 1 and 0 otherwise. So if you're an Elecraft rig, you got a 1's yes. If you're a Flex rig, you're 1. Your ICOM rig, 1, and so on and so on. So this is all relative, excuse me, relative to the non-big name manufacturers. So notice that even with price controlled and the year that it was introduced to the market, bearing in mind Elecraft and Flex came along later, and we're going to see that in the next slide, Elecraft and Flex do significantly better on the performance index than everybody else. You're an ICOM rig, makes no difference. Has no impact versus a no-name rig. And I hate to call them no-name. I don't mean it as a derogatory thing. I just mean the lesser name. A Kenwood rig, you're a little less. A Yaesu rig, you're about 4 points down. And so all the differences in the Sherwood performance, Nick, if you'll point out that little R square equals 0.688 at the very bottom, or almost at the bottom of there, you see R square 688. That means that 69% of all the differences on the Sherwood index can be accounted for by those variables. So price does have an effect, and it has an important one. It's just not the dominant effect. When a rig was made has a very important effect. And if you're with Elecraft and Flex, according to these data, that makes a difference. So 2/3 of all the differences in the performance are tied up with these variables. Now let's go to satisfaction. I'm going to wave my arms again. Remember, this is the cumulative lifetime satisfaction over all the ratings. That R squared is only 0.199. So about 20% of the variation in satisfaction is related. So right off the bat, we get performance is more tied to price, when it was built, and who built it. Satisfaction is less tied. The beta, Nick, is 0.289 versus 341 on satisfaction. So money does make you happier. You may be justifying your purchase. Who knows? It's just not as much as it is on performance. None of the other variables make a difference in satisfaction. They're not, none of the rest of them are significant. So satisfaction equation means what? There's some things we aren't measuring that shape satisfaction. I'll come back to that. The big question from this Why doesn't price make more of an impact? It makes an impact, but why isn't it stronger? Next slide. Now, here's something you can kind of see. This is that bang for the buck, the performance to price ratio. And I'm looking at it when the rig was introduced. And look at what we see. On the performance, these two Johnny come latelys, Elecraft and Flex, they came into the market late after the established ones were already there, and they've gotten better, and they lead. Kenwood came in um, about where ICOM was, and you look at the pattern on their performance on the rigs that Rob rated. Now, remember, this isn't every rig these manufacturers release to the market. It's only what Rob has in his table. But they kind of move forward. They come in third and fourth. ICOM, it was up at the top in the 1980s. It slipped back down to the non-named manufacturers, and then it's now finally come back up. So the other line is all the manufacturers that are not named Elecraft, Flex, Kenwood, Yaesu, and ICOM. So the price, the performance per price got better over time, even with the release of premium rigs. You, even though the money went up, you got a lot more. And in fact, you got more and more than the price went up. So that performance for price has gone up. And according to these data, Elecraft and Flex hit the market, and they've continued to improve in terms of the Sherwood performance price index and the performance to price ratio over time. Let's look at satisfaction. Next slide. All right, now I'm going to cut to the chase. All that's random noise, even though the changes over time are random noise. And you can see they meander along. ICOM was low thanks to that R72. It was the lowest, but you'll see where the action is, and they flop around. And Elecraft came in. They have good satisfaction. They've improved. Flex came in with the 3,000 and 1,500, and then they've declined. I think, honestly, my best guess, having owned them, having talked to hams who have them, being involved in the Flex community, as well as I'm a member of every one of these other groups communities. So I read a lot of what people are saying when they own them. There's a group of hams that like the performance, but they aren't real happy with using a computer to drive the car. I mean, I think it really just comes down to that. Even if you put a knob on it, which is what the M models of the 6,000 class has. And then the Maestro is their little tablet remote radio access tool. And it's, about the same. I mean, there's a group of people, you can divide that market. I'm going to guess back when automobiles began to have an automatic transmission, you had people that still liked the manual and those who liked the automatic. And then you've got people that won't drive the other one. I'm not sure about that, but there's something going on with the Flex on satisfaction that the market is really divided, at least as far as these data are concerned. Next slide. So what do we know? Well, all this is new. I don't think it's been done before. There's been some hits and misses on looking at some of it, but nobody's ever put that together. It's a unique opportunity to look at what Steve Ford at the ARL asked. How do you know which rig is best without throwing away money? Now, best is not universal. It's what you want to maximize. It's idiosyncratic to the individual ham. If you don't believe me, spend a couple of evenings and read every one of the reviews on eHam for a given rig. And you'll see some widely varying reasons. And the top rated ham will inevitably, or rig will inevitably have a few hams who give it low ratings. I didn't like how it was packed. I hate plastic peanuts. I'm giving it a 2 or giving it a 4 instead of a 5. I'm kind of using some hyperbolic language there, but their satisfaction, no matter how strange it is to you, is valid because it's valid to them, just like your reasons are valid to you. And so you have to consider what's best. And I think the results help you narrow down the scope of rigs to consider. Next slide. Now, I'll make a few other comments in. The price is related to performance and satisfaction. It's just smaller than we would like to think. So price doesn't guarantee you anything, and it is a factor. If you spend more money, you're probably going to get a better rig, but you might not. Performance is measured is the rigs today are better than they've ever been. And as I say, it just isn't close. Now, the typical satisfaction is based on a number of things. Received performance is only one of them. And price is only moderately related. The things that we don't have measured are the features. When I look at the reviews and I look at things online, it's the idiosyncratic. I don't like the AGC where you have to turn it more than one revolution. Well, they're giving you a fine grain thing. Well, I hate it. I don't like it. I want knobs. I want radio with a knob. You don't like that. The tilt bell should be higher. I can't see it. All those things are elements of rig design and performance that are not observed here. Don't have them. And I've floundered with this because I'm not sure I could codify all the features that would be a complete list and then go back and see which of these rigs actually has them. And moreover, how well they're implemented. So I'm just not sure you can ever get there from here on the feature set and the ergonomics, because ergonomics vary a great deal. So clearly with satisfaction, there's some things that are not being measured, but narratively, if you read them, they'll tell you what they don't like about it. Now, here's the other thing that's a little bit controversial. You have an extreme amount of loyalty with something. I'm a Kenwood guy. I love that audio. Don't you tell me that Kenwood is not a good radio. Well, I'm not trying to tell you anything. I'm just showing you what the data show. And you can either blame all the other hams for not loving a radio, or you can blame somebody for wanting too much for it. That's clearly hurt ICOM. They were the purveyor of the premium rigs, and their pricing is a little higher. But when you get to the measured performance, as Rob Sherwood has conducted, the price to the performance ratio kind of hurt ICOM a bit. I got some ICOM radios. I just got a new ICOM 9700. So I like ICOM in general, but that's what the data say. So the major name brands really just don't seem to have much long-term or broad impact on average satisfaction. It may affect your personal satisfaction, but when you get all the people who rate it together, it just doesn't make much difference there. And the jury might be out, but when you put them together and you look at the average, they just don't have much of a connection with given manufacturer. Now, when I scrape all the individual ones and I look at it, I may have a different opinion, but the jury is still out. Let's go to the next slide. Now, all of the manufacturers got better over time, better. And in some ways, Elecraft and Flex came into the marketplace at a really good time. If you could be in a time machine that says, I'm going to make my mark as a transceiver manufacturer. Let me go back and say, when will be a good time to go to in my time machine and start building radios? Well, the answer was in the 2000s. And Elecraft and Flex, two hams, Eric Schwartz and his colleague, who were portable operations hams in the Northwest, Gerald Youngblood, who was here in where I live in the Jackson, Mississippi area, moved out to Austin, Texas later. They got in the radio building business with different ideas, and they captured the post-2000 innovation in microelectronics, cheaper parts, greater computing power. And I don't mean big computers. I mean the chips that do instruction set processing, that give you DSP, that give you phase lock looping, and so on and so on. They came in at the right time. They have jumped out in these data, Elecraft and Flex radio system. Now, I label the three groups that rise to the top in different ways: sweet spot, the hot rods, and the contenders. They're all high performing on these measures, and particularly relative to their introductory price to the market, and they stand out for different reasons. So I would encourage you to evaluate those if you're looking, but always keep your own preferences as the driving force. And if you can't see the darn dial, find another radio is my advice, because after all, it's your money. Next slide. And I've tried to juggle these things together, and I do hope it will help you. I will have it out there. You've got the full paper with some more detail. I've just sent my edits on the last version, the part 2 of the article for the National Contesting Journal. I had to cut about 1,300 words out. So that longer article that Nick has and is posted will give you a more complete one. I'll have more information on my foxmikehotel.com website within the month. It may take me a little bit of time to get that on there and get it working properly. But I hope this has helped you in thinking about rigs. It's certainly one approach. And it may not be your cup of tea and statistics, but on the other hand, I hear tell, as I joke with Bob Allison, man, you not everybody likes reading the bench reviews from from the QST magazine. So let's go next slide, and I think that's it. Here, that's who I am, what I do. I make fun of myself with my own logo with Fox Mike Hotel, so that I always steal the thunder if anybody wants to make fun of me, because I've got my own funny little logo there. So thank you for listening to me. I'll be happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
Brilliant. Thank you, Frank. That was fascinating. Fascinating there. And I got there in the end with following your slides, and you did follow Boris Johnson in the end. So, right. Who wants to go first on any questions, contributions to the discussion?
I wouldn't mind going first. Good evening.
Yeah, far away.
Hi. Good evening. I'm Brian Nuttall from M0 OIG from Blackpool. So a long way from you. Thanks for letting me watch the last couple of talks. They've been very, very interesting, and I've enjoyed tonight as well. So thank you very much for that. So my 2 points really are regarding the actual things on eham.net. So the first point there is that whilst most of the eham.net ratings are normally fairly positive,
Right.
I believe that statistically, if you have a bad experience, you normally tell 11 people, and if you have a good one, you normally only tell 3. That's what the saying is over here in the UK, as far as I'm aware. And the other thing that you haven't captured is the volume of sales, which might have a greater analysis on how many people like it, for want of a better word. So you might not be able to get that data, to be honest, certainly not the older radios for sure. So you might find that difficult, but do you think those 2 measures might come into play somewhere?
Okay, let me deal with your first one. You made the argument that if you have a bad experience, you open the box, you turn it on, smoke comes out, right? That's bad. That's never good. You tell 10 people. Well, then why are all the reviews so positive?
That's exactly my point. I have no idea, because that doesn't make any sense, apart from, I suppose, if you have a good experience, you're more likely to take the time to go onto the website and do it.
Right. And look, I've done research in consumer economics, and I think you're spot on. But it's clear, though, that there's, if anything, a halo effect on EHAM. That is, they tend to be skewed to the right. And so you can say, well, they're rubbish, throw them away. Okay, then you have no measure of satisfaction other than just narrative. So, on the one hand, as I said, I'm not going to tell you they're perfect. And I think I'm going to find out more of what you're getting at when I scrape all the individual reviews. And I can use another technique called multi-level modeling to look at how these things affect individual reviews, of which there will be more variation. But so your question's well taken in that sense. On the one hand, if you think a bad review gets out, okay, then people don't buy it, so then they don't rate. Well, it could be. There's a real halo effect there. So if you have a bad rating, it may mean that there really is a problem. And if you look at them, now we'll tell you. All right, first thing that someone told me, yeah, that's all goofed up because you got some that only have like 4 ratings. I thought, yep, being a statistician that I am, I know about asymptotic relative efficiency, and when that thing, a variance seems to stabilize, I used to teach it. So I'm very aware of it. So I looked at it. But you know what I found? Having a small number of reviews doesn't mean it's a high average or low average. They're really random. So it doesn't bias which direction that the review is going. Because I was concerned about that. I mean, absolutely. So I think when I've got the individual ratings, I think I may be able to address your question on satisfaction a little better. Now, we'll never know who talked to who. I mean, that's something that will never be observed. But I think by looking at that, that is part of what I'm going to do. Plus, I'm going to analyze their narrative using some of the contemporary text analysis methods to create sentiment scores and put some statistical numbers on what the narrative means, basically using artificial intelligence. It's not AI, but that's, it's natural language processing is what it is. And that's often part of AI, but that's going to happen. Let me go to your second one. If I ask my good friend Ray Novak, who's a native of Mississippi, to give me a sales record of all the ICOM rigs, because I'm a friend of his, he'd look at me and just laugh. If I wasn't a friend of his, there might be a certain hand gesture he would use to give me an answer. Companies are not going to tell you how many they sold. Now, there are some crude estimates that you can get because some resellers will tell you how many they sold. But let's walk down the path on that argument. So if a rig sold a lot, like the ICOM 7300, in recent years, they have just sold, I don't know how many. So what's your conjecture about what would that do for satisfaction of rig? If a lot of people are buying it, then it must be a lot of people are going to like it. Is that what I'm hearing?
I'm assuming so, yeah, because people won't buy it if it wasn't an excellent. Well, I'm saying an excellent.
If it didn't, at least it didn't perform as to their expectations.
Yeah.
You touched on something that is like that third rail when you're riding a subway. If you touch that third rail, you're going to get electrocuted. The problem is expectations. We don't know what they expect a rig to be. I wish I had the data to look at how much pre-advertising there is. I think when you pre-advertise a rig, you create dissatisfaction because it can never live up to it. That's just the basis I have. I have no way to look at it. I know that happens in some other marketing campaigns. Clearly. Why wouldn't it work in amateur radio? Well,
a bit like self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it?
Well, in some way, yes. See, in some ways it is. Now, I honestly think Flex is dealing with some of that because there was the SDR revolution. Well, there's been kind of a rebellion in some sectors of the market. And if you look at some of the Flex communities, Flex took their open community away and put it on their own website because you just had the bashers that would get in and run everybody else out. I mean, truly. And so I think there's some very divided, gosh, I'm not getting into politics, Emma. There's a very divided opinion about Flex. Now, I've had a couple of Flex radios. I've had a Perseus SDR from Italy for 12 years or something. So I'm an SDR person in terms of I understand how they work. I've used them for a long time. They can give you the best reception. The best reception I've ever had in my life was a Perseus SDR and a Wellbrook loop. Absolutely. Now that's been superseded, but so I'm positive about SDR, but I think a lot of hams just have a negative. And I think part of it is not the SDR. when they released smart SDR software as opposed to power SDR, which is open source, it got really, really complicated. And you know, there's just so much time in the day that people have. It's like if you had to go out and repair your car or tune up your car before you go down to the grocery every time, you're not going to be in love with that car.
No.
And I'm not saying that's the way it is with Flex. I'm just saying that Flex has a lot of stuff there. And what I read on their community stuff is a lot of problems. It may turn out to be the ham just doesn't understand how to operate their PC. And half of, I would say proverbially half of what Flex has to deal with is operator error. But when you're looking at that operator to give a rating on EHAM, they don't have to be objective. It's patently subjective. So I think you've released some of that. And yet, how many don't ever go to EHAM to see what the other fellas or gals think about a new rig? We do it.
I don't know. I don't know. Well, I can tell you is when I bought my last, I was some of the things you mentioned about people being very conscious of the different, you know, I'm a Yaesu man, I'm a Kenworth man, I'm an Icon man. Saw that all the way through from the day one I was getting licensed. You must buy a Yaesu, and to be honest, I did like Yaesu, but I literally, as I went on, I learned and things change and things move on, and you know that's why I saw in your graph when it said Yaesu was going to write a big nosedive. I absolutely know why, but that's by the by. The way I feel it is all those menus, etc. But listen, I think we've taken up a lot of these gentlemen's time.
But
I'm very sorry.
Brian, yeah, thank you.
Right. You made a good point. Let me close on your questions with this. There are characteristics of manufacturers. We call them house effects. Okay. Kenwood's known for audio. They're not known for putting out 3 rigs a year. I mean, if they put out 2 rigs in 5 years, they're moving fast, but they're known for audio. Yaesu is known for menus. I've got 3 Yaesus I used for my portable operations team. The price point was good. Their weight was good. Their performance was at least good enough. And you learn one Yaesu menu, you kind of good on the other. So they're known for menus. And ICOM's known for the way they do things. I've got a partner on my portable ops teams. He's an ICOM guy. He really doesn't want to sit down at one of my Yaesus and operate. So I hear what you're saying. In these data, for the aggregate average rating, it just doesn't make much difference when you take everybody into account. But it might when I look at the individual ones. So it's 2 great questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Brian. I've got John G8JMB followed by Roger G4UFZ. Over to you, John.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for a splendid talk. Quite an exhaustive introduction there. But I notice the rigs that seem to come out on top are way, way, way out of price connotation. Thousands of pounds. Bear in mind, we pay here in pounds what you pay in dollars, roughly, despite the exchange rate. I've been looking at more entry-level rigs, and am I going to be able to drive it? I don't do it all day, every day. I pick it up maybe once a week, maybe less often. I ain't going to get the book of words out to find out how to drive it if the book of words tells me. And that's what I call, operability. Call me a radio telephone operator if you like, but I want frequency, volume, and go. Those are the only controls I want, really, or maybe tune the aerial antennas, sorry. It's difficult. I've looked at EHAM reviews, and they're so subjective. They're of, I hate to say, but of little value to anybody else because they're converted preaching to the converted without any technical background. I may be overstating the case here. I don't know. I don't think so. But it puts you in a very difficult position. You see all the toys. What can I get for my money? Rather than this is the best. I've got this much dough. What can I get for it? Which is the least worst? Just a thought there.
Well, look, I remember your comment after the Sherwood presentation, and I thought you had some very good comments. You were talking a bit about audio and the quality of audio through the chain.
Yeah.
And you may have had Bob Howell talk about that when he gave a talk to your club. So there's no question. Now, notice 2 things about what you said. I didn't tell you which one was best. I just said, I'm optimizing on these characteristics, and you have to use your judgment. Now, I agree we said the same thing, but different words. When I said that they're subjective and they're idiosyncratic to an individual, what you may want, the next person may not want. And if you look at those EHAM, and believe me, I've read them. Here's my opinion about some of the EHAM rigs or EHAM ratings. I read the narrative. I look at who the person doing the rating is. I look them up on QRZ. So I get a sense of who the rater is. Takes time. And you have some who are good engineers themselves. They understand a lot about the radios. I know what they do by virtue of what they say they do, and they are very competent. Some others just may not be. And I think you put it politely, and I'm going to leave it that way too. And yet that is why a consumer satisfaction measure is not a bench measure. They are fundamentally two different things. And that's part of what my paper was predicated upon, was to illustrate how they work very differently. Now,
Yeah.
and I hope it has, but I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, I'd say there's different ways of looking at these things, and it's difficult to separate. Well, it's not really difficult to separate out, but I think you've got to separate out those who use amateur radio as a way of life and those who use it as an occasional hobby. And that's where the usability part really comes in.
Now,
And
remember what I said
I'm not
about
going to
Flex?
spend,
What I said about
£4,000
Flex
on a
was
rig.
remember when you said the book of words, that applies to Flex. There's an awful lot you have to learn to be an efficient user of the Flex 6000. And many don't have the time or won't take the time, but then blame Flex for it. So I think we're on the same page there.
Yeah, I would agree with that viewpoint. If you're in something like that, personally, I'm not interested. I've got other things to do. I go sailing, weather permitting. But okay, well, thank you very much. Anyway, it's very enlightening.
Well, I enjoyed your comments always.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, John. I've got Roger, and then I've got Darren.
Hi, Frank. Thanks for talk. Very interesting. I wondered, it's obviously a lot of effort. I wonder how many man hours have gone into this. It looks like an enormous amount of effort. And I also,
how much time I've got into doing this? Was that the comment?
Yeah, no, yeah, just the total hours you've spent doing this.
Well, all right, two things. All right, two things. I've done this for 40 years. I mean, I've done hundreds of studies like this. So it's like if you go to a dentist and say, wow, you mean you pull that tooth out of that person's mouth and you put another one in 30 minutes? I do 3 of them a day. And I'm not saying it's trivial. I'm just saying that's part of what my skill set is and what I've done. I spent probably 30 hours, maybe, I'm going to guess, over a period of time with this, but I'm, I guess, fairly efficient at doing it because I've done this a lot. So, but thank you. I understand it was some effort.
It's very impressive. And following on from that, then you published this data. I wonder if anybody's yet tried to influence you or nobble you. The manufacturers, is this something interesting to them? No. And I will tell you, now look, I personally know Ray Novak. Yesu's had a change. I knew the previous sales director, John Kruk, the current one, I don't know as well. I know Kenwood guy pretty well. Phil Parton is his name. I know Gerald Youngblood. I don't really know Eric Schwartz that well. I met him and talked to him. Those are the main manufacturers. But I think they know, the ones that know me well enough to don't go barking up that tree. Thank you very much. Because
I write a blog and I may tell on them. So no, my integrity on those matters is paramount, because I just believe, as a statistician and as a scholar, when you lose that, you'll never get it back.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Thanks, Frank. Darren.
Yes, good evening, Frank, and thank you for the presentation. I might be asking the wrong person the wrong question here, but I'm going to give it a go. Flex radio seems to come very highly in your lists, and I am a Flex fan. I use a 3000, which I know is one of the earlier rigs, but you scored the 1500 quite highly. The one thing that puzzles me a little bit, and I might be missing the mark here, you say a lot of the top contesters use the Flex radios. I've tried using Flex in a contest, and because you're trying to do the Flex radio, which is run by the computer, and also logging software run by the computer, I find it very, very difficult, and I always end up going back to a traditional radio. I just wonder if you have any insight on that.
Well, if I gave you that impression that contesters use Flex radio, I either misspoke or something. Some contesters do, and you'll see them in the ads, but it's not many. Now, I'm not a big time contester, even though I'm publishing in the National Contesting Journal. That doesn't make me a big contester. Dr. Scott Wright is someone I'm collaborating on research with. He's the previous editor of the National Contesting Journal, and he is a big time contester. Don Field over on your side of the pond is someone I work with on the Portable Ops Challenge. He's editor of Practical Wireless, president of the UK DX Foundation. Don is a paramount contester. I don't know what they use. I know Scott doesn't use the SDR. A few people do. So I really think people like Tim Duffy, K3LR, he manages DX Engineering as a company here. He has a super station in Western Pennsylvania. I don't remember what he uses. It might be Elecraft K3s, but I think there's a wide variety of non-Flex radios that are being used in contests. But if I gave the impression that all the contestants have gone Flex, they haven't.
No, so you didn't give the impression that all do by any means. It was just a little bit of a hint in that direction. I like my Flex, don't get me wrong. I use it an awful lot. I use it mainly for data these days. I believe data modes on a computer run by a radio that is basically a computer works very, very well. But when it comes to straightforward radio, I still like the traditional radios. I mainly use the 7800, which I still think is good value for money, even though it's now, 20 years old, maybe even more.
Yeah. I have a Swan 550CX from the 60s, and I have a Drake TR7, and I plan to keep them in the mix as long as they'll light up and play. And I try to keep some of those. Let me just say for the record, I bought my Flex 6400, and it took me a couple of years to put that together to do it. I did have the 3000, and I sold my 3000 to a friend of mine, and that was a Christmas present last year. So no, I don't get any stuff for free from manufacturers, and wouldn't do that. There are people who do. There are people who get review units, and they may or may not send them back, and that's to each his own. On the ICQ podcast, we don't take any advertising for that reason. So when we say something, we're just not beholden to anyone. We've had some manufacturers offer us money to advertise on our podcast, but we don't do that. And as someone who does evaluation stuff, and I've done that for programs for years, it's more of an integrity thing. I just don't. But anyway, Flex is in an interesting position. Many would say they are the future. As I said when I talked to you earlier, there are many futures, and it remains to be seen. Anon, as you noticed, has some things going for it that are very, very good. And they have some things like pure signal noise reduction that Flex has not quite implemented yet, for example. And so Anon is another SDR-based rig that is doing quite well. It's an interesting time, but overall, as the graph showed, we've got better receivers now than we ever have, and it's just not even close.
I think at the end of the day, there's not a bad radio out there, is there? But thank you very much.
If it's a relatively new one, you might have some that got released early. I will say Zygu. I've got an X5 105, and I've got a G90.
I did order that GSOC front head unit, and boy, did they rush that out. I wound up just canceling my order for it until they get their act together. They're a little company in China trying to make it, and they're trying to get revenue in and to fund R&D, and they got the GSOC out. Now the G90 works, and I'm interested to see what Rob Sherwood's tests say. But you know, just like before we went recording, someone was talking about buying another nano VNA. Who would have ever predicted, if they knew what a VNA did, that you could buy one for 50 to 75 bucks per pound? Incredible. So Xiegu is capturing the evolution, as Elecraft and Flex did, you know, from post 2000, in what's going on. And it's sort of a great day to be a designer. You may not be able to buy aluminum today very well. I'm waiting on a couple of antennas where the manufacturer says we can't get the aluminum to mill the parts. So, but it's a great day to build radios, I think.
Yeah, good. Is it Xiegu that you use, Nick?
Yeah, I've got the Xiegu, the same as Frank, the 5105. Yeah,
Is that the one we took up to Black Hill? Because that was
it is. Yeah.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
bought their little amplifier to go with it, and that is a decent amplifier. And it's got some features that are pretty good. Got an ATU in it. So I got it because I had the two radios, and I thought, well, I've got to do that. Once you do that, then the GSOC came out, but it's just not worth it. But anyway, it's a tool, and you probably agree, Nick, when the sunspots and the propagation are not right, you're doing digital or you're doing nothing on the 5-watt job. But we're getting better. So that the 5105 just might be nice to carry with you now as the sunspots get a little better.
Okay, thanks, Darren. Thanks, Frank. Anyone else with a question or comment they want to make? Wave at me if you have. Can't see anyone frantically wanting to talk. If we've exhausted, Gerald, yeah, go on. Gerald,
I'm on now. That's better. I haven't got the microphone pressed. Hello there, Frank. Thank you very much. Fascinating talk. You did mention one of my radios on it, and I was quite interested to see that one, of course. But it really was interesting to compare them all. And the question really is, there's one or two of them. You said about them bringing out later variations on them, and do them variations normally make quite a substantial difference? I know you said you probably ignored them, but do they make a lot of difference?
Okay. Now, I think what you're referring to is where Rob Sherwood took a small number, a handful, out of all of the rigs on this table. And there was either a modification that the manufacturer made in a, like the, not even as big as the 590S versus SG. I mean, something smaller than that. And he might have done another bench test suite on it. Well, when you think about it for a moment, you're in my shoes, you don't have that for all the rigs. So how do you make it consistent? It's just like the price thing. So I chose to stay with the first analysis. Now, to answer your question of doesn't it make a difference? Well, the 590S to SG made a big difference, and I pointed that out. But if you'll look at Rob's table, you'll see where he has maybe a half dozen. I may be off on the number, but something like that. A half dozen where there was a second sample. And you look at the numbers and tell me if you see a big difference. I didn't see anything dramatic, which is why I made the decision I did. But certainly the 590S, it had the ALC overshoot, which gave people fits on their amplifiers if they were running into that problem. 590SG solved that problem, I think, and added some more features. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about very, very small tweaks. So take a look at his table. You'll see the same rig, but second sample. I did not include that second sample in it. And you look and compare the stock rig with the second sample and see if his measurements are very different. That's about the only way I can answer your question.
Yeah, okay, thanks. It does actually. Funny enough, you ticked on the same radio I was thinking of, because the radio club, we've got to 590, and I was trying to work out which, I can't even remember which one it is now. Darren might remember, or Phil or somebody. But we've
Well, I
got
had
the
the
590, and that
590S,
was what triggered the question.
590S and the 590SG were separate rigs in, as he has in his data table.
Yeah.
And I mentioned the satisfaction level move in the data. I didn't put it in the upper quadrant because there just wasn't enough room, but I mentioned that in passing. There's where a manufacturer update to a popular rig move the needle on EHAM.
Yeah.
That's not hard. That's not easy to do. So I made that mention because they fixed some of the problems that the 590S had. So, and if you'll note, there are many contest teams, their stock radio is the 590S, and they have it set up for the way they like to contest, and that's what they go with. But I have a 590SG as well, and I got hats from all the manufacturers in my closet. I kind of use them all, and I'm not particularly loyal to one. I buy rigs as I can and want to that have features that appeal to me. But yeah, but I hope you like your 590SG. I like mine. I mean, I've got a friend, a close friend, who has a 590G as his main shack rig, and Mike loves it.
I've got a 570 and a 590 at my own as well, but they are really good rig. But when I buy mine, I tend to have another thing about the price. Or in Yorkshire, where I was saying how much, and that price drops a bit. Back onto Nick, please.
Well, notice one thing that's happened, and Kenwood is like ICOM. They've gotten into the premium rig business, and we can talk about the 590SG and the fact that, hey, it's a good rig. Okay, it's a good rig. Here's measurements and all this stuff. They've got the 890, which is a step up in price, and the 990, which is an even bigger step up in price. But when you look at the paper that I sent to Nick that he distributed, the performance for price. So what are you buying for that? You're buying ergonomics and features. And that's really a subtle point. I'll try to make it not so subtle. Some of the higher price rigs that don't perform any better, according to Sherwood, and don't get any more love on EHAM, but why people are buying them are the feature set and the ergonomics. And people are willing to pay for that. Not everybody can afford to, but it's just like automobile. I think a Bentley is a wonderful car. I'll never own one. I've ridden in a few, but rigs are a little bit like that. And Kenwood has gotten into the premium pricing, just like ICOM has. But relative to the dollar, the performance thus far hasn't skyrocketed.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, good evening, Frank, and thanks very much indeed. Is your most used rig then the 590? What
No.
you use in your shack?
No. And I'll be honest, I have people ask me, what's your main rig? And I go, I don't have a main rig. Well, you've got to have a main rig. No, you have to have a main rig because you think there is a main rig in your shack. I don't have a main rig in my shack. I like to use them all. I even like to go back to that old Swan that will make me turn the air conditioning down because it generates heat. So I don't have a primary rig. It sort of depends on what strikes me at the moment. And I know that may seem odd, but that's what those idiosyncratic preferences are. So the Flex has got some capability that's undeniable. I do like the audio in the Kenwood, and it's relatively simpler to operate. I have an ICOM 7300, and they've announced some new firmware, and that will probably become my FT8 rig in the shack because there's going to be a touch screen button. You open up that menu, then it says FT8, and boom, there you are. That will probably become my FT8 rig. Why? Very easy to use. So I have to let the Swan warm up a little bit. And you know what they say about the Swan? If it's not on frequency, don't worry about it. It will be eventually. So, and I still enjoy my Drake TR7. It's got dual passband tuning and I love it. So I don't have a main rig.
Right. In my shack, I've got the 7700, which, as you know, is a huge rig.
Right.
I've got a little 7000. And in my car for portable, not for mobile, for portable, I use a 480 sat, Kenwood 480 sat. I get as much fun out of using that little Kenwood as I do with the big 7700. It's simple, straightforward, it's easy to use, and I just find it a joy to use.
Let me comment on that, because you have touched on something that is very important, I think. Now, remember when Volkswagen Beetle came out as an automobile? People fell in love with it. I think the G90 is the Volkswagen right now. The G90 rig is just fun to use, and you don't have much money in it. And if you drop it in the pond, you can still have your main rig at home. Now, I'm a little funny because I don't like to take my rigs in my shack out to the field for portable, although I do a lot of portable operating. Honestly, for portable on my portable ops team, I have a Yaesu FT450D built into a case. That's my main portable contesting and operating rig. I have an FT891. I love that. It's in a small case with a battery. I have a big park next door. I live on a big reservoir, and I can go next door to that park. I don't have much with me. I can walk down there. I love that. Throw a wire up in, sit at a table, have a Biano battery. I enjoy that. And I've got the two Zygu rigs. Now, my Yaesus and my Zygus, you know, somebody came by and decided they wanted them more than I wanted them. My life, your radio or your life, take them. But I wouldn't feel like I've lost my main ability. So the Yaesus for me are my portable rigs. Now we're into the Yaesu Fusion. I have several Yaesu repeaters that I have in the area, and we have the FTM 400 both in my shack and my vehicle. So I'm like a mutt from the pound. I don't have a particular breed. I kind of go to a lot of different ones, and I will tell you, for the money and for just operating like you're talking about, just sit down and let's operate and talk to people and that kind of thing. I like the FT891. Now, it does not have a built-in ATU, but I bought the MFJ 939Y. I said, okay, they don't have a tuner that says it works with the 891. When did the 891 come out? It came out after the 450. I'll bet you they use the same instruction set. So I bought a 939Y from MFJ, which is just up an hour and a half in Starkville. I plugged the cable in. I told it was a 450. Bob's your uncle. It works fine. I went back up to the factory and set it up and showed them it works perfectly with the 891 if you tell the tuner, the outboard tuner, that it's a 450. And so it fits right on top of it. I love the 891. So for you, like you, I enjoy the 891. It's got a great DSP, got a great noise blanker. And so you heard me rave on about Yaesu there. It wasn't in my talk, but that's my personal preference. The 590 SG came up very well as in the numbers. So I think a lot of it's what you like. And I hope that out of this study, it's going to make an impression, is that we talk about how much you're going to spend. We're going to spend on what we like. Maybe not one that performs as well, but we're going to spend on what we like for various different reasons, not the same reason.
It was interesting you mentioned the VW Beetle. 40 odd years ago, my wife was looking at one, or I was looking at one for my wife, and she took it for a drive, and I was raving on about it, saying it's good value for money. And she said, okay, you have the Beetle and I'll have your car. and we didn't buy a Beetle.
Well, I had the Beetle and I had the bus, and they're just fun to drive.
Yeah,
So,
but quirky,
absolutely.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. Very interesting, Frank. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I've got no one else waving at me, so I'm going to thank Frank first of all for really interesting discussion. And I was very pleased that, Roger, you asked Frank how much time he'd spent writing this, because it looked to me like you'd done quite a lot of work on this, Frank. And I'm delighted that you came along and shared it with us. And I know you've got your article in the contest journal, and we've circulated that round. And if someone hasn't got the link from me on that, drop me an email and I will make sure that I'll send you the link. It's on the Club Google Drive for anyone who wants it. So, Frank,
listen, thank you very much for having me back. And it's purely a delight to meet with you. And like I say, anytime you can't get a good speaker, let me know. I might be available. I'll try to have something to say. And I'm glad this was of interest to you.
That's great. Can we show our appreciation to Frank in the normal way? So thanks, everyone. Brilliant. Thanks, Frank. I'm going to just stop the recording. So I'm going to a couple of bits of news before we sign off for the night.
Let's say